Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you to the Finance and Audit Committee of the Sacramento Metropolitan Fire District. Welcome one and all. Let's see, we have our call to, do you need to read anything from the online statements or anything like this?
No, not for this meeting, no.
Okay, just checking, keeping you
Yes.
on your toes.
I
there,
can take a roll,
Madam
though.
Clerk. Yes, you will, because that's the first thing that's up
Okay.
on my box. Call to order. And we'd like to have a roll call, please.
Yes, Director Weber.
Present.
Director Clark. Director Jones.
Here.
Thank you. All are present.
All right, thank you very much. Now we have the public opportunity to discuss matters of public interest within the committee's scope, including items on or not on the agenda. Madam Clerk, do we have any speaker cards or anyone online?
I have no speaker cards for this meeting. We're checking online.
No one online.
All right, thank you very much. Let's see, now we move to consent items. We have 2 items on consent calendar. Chair will entertain a motion for approval. Okay, we have a first by Director Clark and a second by Director Weber. Please vote.
Yes, Director Weber.
Aye.
Director Jones.
Yes.
Director Clark. Thank you. Motion passes.
All right, thank you, everyone. Moving on to presentation items. Number 1, we have a final budget presentation by CFO O'Toole. Welcome to the podium, Mr. O'Toole. Please proceed.
Thank you and good evening, Madam Chair, directors and Fire Chief House and colleagues and members of the public. Tonight I have 2 presentations, the final budget which we'll do first and then the bi-monthly fiscal report. So starting with the final budget, PowerPoint coming up momentarily. For tonight's budget, we'll be using 2 points of reference, and I'll be clear on what we're referring to on the slides. Both the preliminary budget, which was, of course, was the budget you just passed in June, and also 23-24, the prior year. What you'll hear tonight is revenues updates and carryover savings from last year have modestly improved the district's fiscal picture relative to prelim. There's a dip into reserve this year. It's still necessary as presented in prelim. It's just about $1 million less. And the district will fund unanticipated expenditures related to things like higher apparatus costs, higher fuel costs, and a negotiated wage increase that was about 1% higher because of the higher property tax revenues in this report. So this is your final budget overview slide. We're comparing here prelim and final. You can see the top left box is general fund for prelim in the italics, and then final shown with the final column. And then below that, directly below that, is the general fund reserve amounts. And then off to the side is all funds for prelim and final. That uses the same rows for revenues, expenditures, and other financing sources and change in fund balance. So to go over that with you, let's see, for focusing just on the general fund box there, revenues are anticipated to be nearly $288 million in the final budget. Expenditures are $309 million. And comparing the 2 columns, you can see that preliminary general fund revenues rose $7 million and general fund expenditures rose $5 million relative to the prelim. Let's see, continue down those columns. Other financing sources which is mainly the net of transfers in and out of the general fund, are $15.5 million. And what that means is that revenues and other financing sources those are largely transfers in the IGT fund. Together with revenues were still less than expenditures, which gets to that where you see the negative almost 5.9. That is the amount that we're going to take out of the reserve. For reference, that was 6.8 in the prelim. So there's the change there. Let's see. The property tax growth has been significant. Part of the reason we're dipping into the reserve is it was significant, but it's been declining. 2 years ago, it was 7.8%. This last year, 23-24, it was 5.7%. And now we're anticipating 4.8%. So still growth, just not at the rate we've seen before. The final budget approved for reference, the final budget approved in the fall of 2023, so a year ago, had a projected reserve rate of where we are now in 24-25 of 11.8%. As you can see at the bottom there is 11.7%. So our forecast is pretty close. It's about $300,000 difference out of a $300 million budget. And then the last column off to the right, all funds, just to recognize the numbers there. Take my glasses down here. Yeah, the revenue is 329, almost 330 million, expenditures 381 million. With other financing sources, you add another 17.9 million, and then you with a change in fund balance of negative 33. Now, to be clear, nothing has a negative fund balance. We'll see that on the next slide as well. We're changing fund balance. We're reducing balances. Some of the big items you're aware of that change the fund balance there. Special projects fund takes about 14 million. We expect to spend quite a bit of that this fiscal year. The development impact fees fund, we're taking almost 10 million out of that for station projects there. The general fund, we just talked about, the 5.9 million is included in that. So let's take a look at the fund balance summary. So this is your high level slide of all the funds. And you can see the 7 funds listed across the top there. And the first shaded row is the estimated beginning fund balance. So that's how much we ended last fiscal year with and started this fiscal year with. And then you have the revenues and expenditures, and then the transfers we just talked about. And then you have a change in fund balance. So those numbers start to look familiar. And then at the end of the fiscal year, you have an ending fund balance. So let me just take the general fund as a way to kind of follow it through. So we anticipate that, or actually we had, this is now passed, about an ending balance at June 30th, 2024 of 42.7 million. The revenues, that number I just mentioned, 287.9, expenditures of 309 million, transfers into 15.5. And then all that comes together and you have a shortfall of almost 5.9 million comes out of the general fund. But you can see the reserve fund was 42.7 and now it's reduced to 36.8. That's the $5.9 million difference. So that's how you can interpret that slide. And as you can see, as you look at the bottom or across the most of the balances in the fund are positive, some are zero. That just means we use them all. I want to point that the grants fund is a fund that I typically say, oh, that's zero because we spend it all. We're leaving a balance in it this year because there is a grant we have that requires it to be spent over multiple years. So we got to save that money in it for the subsequent years. There we go. Oh, did I go? I think I went too far. Yeah. So the next slide is general fund revenues. As noted, again, revenues of 287.9 million. It's up 13.2 million from fiscal year 23-24. So now I'm referencing the prior year for the next few slides. Property taxes were 213.1 million, which is almost a $10 million increase. Charges for services are up to 67.7, which is about a $5 million increase. And the medic fees are up to 50.4 million, which is 929,000 over last year. CRD fees are up almost $1 million as well. That's related to the fee increases that were adopted about a year ago, just under a year ago. A big part of our revenues now, or general fund revenues, our IGT program is the IGT funds. These are not in the general fund. These are in a separate fund that goes into the general fund. So I include them here because they are essentially, for practical purposes, they are general fund. So a reminder about what the 2 IGT programs are. The voluntary rate range program, it's an intergovernmental transfer program where we transfer funds up to DHCS and are able to pull funds down to pay for our services to uninsured and Medi-Cal beneficiaries. The revenues anticipated for 24-25 are 15.4 million. With an IGT transfer, the amount we pay to DHCS of 6.2. So it gets you those 2 numbers together, gets you a net income of 8.4 million from VRP in 24-25. It is less, as I note on the slide, by about 300,000. That's because one of the providers, we had 5 providers dropped out and will not be participating this year, so we won't get revenues, and that's that loss of 300,000. For PPGMT, again, that program was established back in 2019. We've been participating in it since January 1, 2023. The revenues are 20 million for this fiscal year with an IGT transfer of 6.8 million and net income of 13.2. So you add the 13.2 million is in net income for PPG-EMT with a net income for VRP, and you get a total of 21.6 million. That's what we're expecting for this fiscal year. Just a couple words on PPG-EMT. Right now, looking at the data of what we've received, we are currently owed about 7.2 million across the 18 months of the programs. So since that January 2023 through June 2024. That figure is shrinking. 2 months ago, it was over 8 million. So it's coming down. It's just coming down slowly. We continue to work with the providers with our biller to encourage those payments. Next is expenditures. So as shown there and as mentioned before, general fund expenditures, 309.3 million, which is $28.6 million higher than last fiscal year. The labor budget, 260.4 million. That is, labor costs will increase as a share of general fund revenues, including net transfers in from the IGT fund, from 81.7% in fiscal year 23-24 to 84.1% in 24-25. Services and supplies are 44.4 million, as noted. We've got a slide coming on that in a moment. So that's your high level general fund expenditures slide. Drilling down a little bit onto the labor side of it. So the labor expense has two parts: compensation and benefits. Compensation, of course, is things like wages, incentives, overtime, and leave buybacks. Benefits includes your PERS and your SCRS payments, your medical, all those things together make up that 260 million labor budget. Wages, total compensation, that first part is 146 million, and that is wages are up by 9.2 as shown. And as shown there, the property tax increase that I mentioned, which triggered a higher wage increase. So it was 3% in the prelim. It's now 4% because the property taxes were updated between prelim and final. Constant staffing, again, 710,000. That's a little higher. It does from prelim, it does include the new squad that will be added on a trial basis, which will require some constant staffing commitments there. So we have to reflect that. Let's see, incentive pays are up 826,000. And total benefits are anticipated to be 114.4 million, which is up nearly 10% more than last year. PERS is up 8.8 million. Medical costs up 2.3 million. And going in the other direction, we have decreased workers' compensation costs of 533,000 relative to last year. Moving on to services and supplies, just some highlighted items here. I mentioned that it's 44.4 million. Of course, some of the big ticket increases they are. The district's liability and property insurance is up 886,000. As noted there, fire equipment servicing, safety clothing and supplies. We are having 2 academies. We're adding more people. There's going to be more costs there. Election services and dispatch services are up in the budget as well. The capital outlay summary. So total capital outlay spending is now 49.7 million. Includes about a 20.4 million commitment from the Capital Facilities Fund. Some of the major items are located there. It is mostly apparatus, as you can see there. In here, the ladder truck replacement, 1.8 million. 4 new ambulances, 1.2. 5 type 1s, 5.8 million. And then type 3 and the technology storage replacement. Major capital outlay facilities projects that are funded with other funds are the grant line acquisition at 2.4 million, the Vineyard Spring Station at 10 million, and Zinfandel at 16.8. Total anticipated expense for this fiscal year. For the next 3 slides, I'm going to focus on our forecast. So this first forecast is the forecast. The next 2 slides are a scenario. So those are just for interest, not reality. But I do, and I'll explain those in a moment. But let's focus on what we expect to happen, what I'm projecting. This is a 5-year forecast, incorporates data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics and from our property tax consultant. And it showed, and some of the main assumptions that I want to disclose here are the annual inflation is held at 3.2%, which is the current year-over-year rate of inflation. So it assumes that it holds flat. You could argue either way on that. For this projection, it's 3.2%. Cost of borrowing is 4.5%, and then gradually declining as down to 3% by the end of by the 5th year, consistent with kind of the discussions you hear about the Fed and cutting rates and so forth. Most of the current PPGMT and VERP revenues are used. The most current PPGMT and VERP revenues are used, but they're grown at about 2%. So it's just a slight incline there. Compensation is increased annually at 3%. So that's, if you took our 10-year look, it'd be closer to 5%, but there were some bumps there. So I took an average of 3% for this 5-year look. Property tax grows at just under 4% from 25-26 to 28-29, consistent with what our property tax consultant projected. So as you can see, just looking at the colors and numbers, the blue columns are the general fund revenue, general fund reserve balance. It's going up every year. The green line, which is your reserve, is climbing towards that red line, which is your 15% reserve line. And by the 5th year, our reserve is 15.1%. So it would take 5 years, if this forecast held, to reach a 15% reserve. So these next 2 slides are, there's really 2 major factors that would, the 2 largest factors, if you will, that drive the forecast are property tax and compensation costs. So this first one is property tax. So this just proposes a 1% growth. So this isn't saying that property tax goes to 0 or goes to negative. It's just saying it only grows at 1% a year. And as you can see here, these are your reserve lines. You can see what's happening to your reserve. That 24-25 is the 11.7%. But then if you assume 1%, just 1% growth each year, it really drops off and you have a negative 8 million reserve at the last year. Of course, the board has many options to respond before this. This wouldn't actually happen, but I just wanted to show that trend, what it looks like if growth were to slow considerably. Perspective. The next also perspective is what if we had 6% compensation growth? So I built in 3% compensation growth. What if you doubled it? So this also shows a decline in the reserve balances from where we are, the 11.7%, going down to let's see, about 6 million in 6 million and about 2% in the last year. So just some things to think about as the board. These are what these factors start to look like if they get adjusted, and if things happen in the economy and our property tax growth plummets. That is something to think about. So those are just for some scenario perspective. You're moving on to your summary. Things I've already mentioned. The general fund budget is balanced by a reserve transfer of 5.9 million. The forecasted general fund declined from 13.4% in 23-24 down to 11.7%. General fund revenue growth, including net transfers, is budgeted at 5.3% higher than prior years. So general fund expenditure growth is 8.8% higher than prior year. But PPG, EMT, and VRP add a net 21.6 million to the district's budget. So that helps too. And the 5-year forecast shows reserve borrowing likely one time, and gradual property tax growth will lead to steady increase in the general fund reserve, subject to, again, those 2 property tax trends and labor cost commitments. So that is the bulk of that is my presentation. Before I turn it over to questions, I do want to recognize that here there have been a lot of changes to a lot of design changes, not so much typical content, design changes to the report. And I want to credit Ron here, Empedrad, and Tara Mailer, and for working with me to really update this and make it a more digestible and clear contextual document. Hopefully it's helpful to you and for your constituents that want to dig into the budget. I think we made a lot of good improvements. So my recommendation here is to receive and file, and then it will go to the board on September 12th. If that's your decision. And with that, I welcome your questions.
Are there any questions from my fellow board members?
No, but I don't like your perspective slides.
Okay.
Yeah, they make me
That's
nervous
good.
too. I don't like them. Do we have any public comment or questions? Okay, well, courtesy. All right, just one quick thing. Is it accurate? Is it fair to say that we have a increase from 3% to 4% in property tax revenue, but other than that, our revised, our final budget here coincides with exactly with what the board was presented with earlier? Is that accurate?
I mean, yeah, that's certainly accurate. It
general
was actually, I think we had 3.8, now we're 4.8. So that in
Okay,
property tax.
3.8. Okay, no, that's what I need to know. 4.8. All right.
Yep.
I don't think we have to vote on presentation. We just receive it. It has been received, Mr. O'Toole. Thank you. we can proceed to number 2.
Okay. So this is the finance and audit bi-monthly fiscal report. And for this year will be, as the slide's coming up, for this year, obviously, we are now past the fiscal year. So this report will cover the full fiscal year. You'll be able to see what happened all 12 months as opposed to 2 months at a time.
Oh, well.
So I'll jump right into the slides in the interest of time. This chart shows updated cash balance trends for all funds through June 30th. Again, the full fiscal year. The red line, and for each of these is 23-24, the year we just left, and the green line is prior year 22-23. The trajectory, as you can see, kind of follows a historical path. And as you can see at the end, cash finished above last year at 80.4 million. That's about $9 million more in ending cash balance. Total revenues, as shown by the arrows, actual revenues were 293.6 million through June, which is 20 million more than the prior year. But nevertheless, actual revenues collections for 23-24 finished 6.5 million below what we had in the mid-year budget. Next is medic revenues. Medic revenues, again, follow closely to the budgeted figure. Actuals on the red line, which starts to look coincide with the blue line there, were 46.3 million. So just 1 million less than what was built into the budget. Compared to last year, that was an increase shown when revenues were 43.6 million. We were $2.8 million higher this year. So that's our medic revenues. The next 2 slides are PPG EMT. As you can see, the target revenues still haven't been reached in any of the months of the first 6 months. Those red lines are all still lower than that gray line at the left, which is about 1.7 million. If you add up all those differences for those first 6 months, it's 1.6 million. That's how much we are owed for those first 6 months of the program. And then jumping into the 23-24 fiscal year, so you've got 12 red lines there. You can see, again, no month has quite hit the 1.7 million expected payment at the far left. All the red lines are lower than that. The differences between collections each month and the monthly target have narrowed, and there's now about $5.6 million owed from for 23-24. Moving from revenues and IGT to expenditures, after 12 months, fiscal year 23-24 actual general fund expenditures relative to mid-year budget are still below budgeted expenditures and over prior year expenditures. So actual expenditures were 288.7, shown there at the right, and which is $5.9 million less than budgeted and $25 million more than prior year, which was at 263.7 million. Moving to a subset of expenditures to labor costs. Labor costs, of course, includes wages, incentives, retirement, healthcare, workers' compensation, all other benefit costs. So that's all thrown into this slide. At the end of June, actual labor costs were 239.3 million, tracking slightly under the mid-year budget figure of 242.2 million, and $9 million higher than last year's end of June figure of 220 million. This next slide is your reserve balances, general fund reserve balances. Again, the red line is 23-24. The green line was the prior year, 22-23. Similar to the cash balance slide, which is the first chart we looked at, there are 2 dips and 2 surges, which have to do with when we receive large property tax transfers from the county and then borrow from the county in what's called the dry period when you're below zero. Let's see, at the end of June, our reserve rose to 39.2 million. That's about $5.3 million higher than last year at the same point when it was 34.9 million. And if you're looking carefully and you see the purple line, which is 15%, you can notice like, yeah, technically we did actually finish the year 23-24 at 15%. And that's the reserve update. Moving on to the CERT fund. So this is our California Employers Retirement Benefit Trust, which we use to pay and offset future non-pension related retirement liabilities, mainly healthcare costs. You can see the number at the top is 87.2 million, excuse me, 87.2 million. When I last reported in June, it was 82.7. So that's a gain of 4.6 million in just 2 months. And that number is climbing. You can see the arc at the far right there. Let's see, since inception, the district has contributed nearly 60.5 million of the total there. And that is the CERT update. Okay, for this next one, Ron Empedrad's going to come up and give us an update on the fraud risk assessment.
Good evening, directors, Chief House, Ron Empedrad, Controller for the district. Just to give you a quick refresher, several months ago, I conducted a fraud risk assessment of the district, the purpose of which is to identify and assess the district's exposure to fraud risk and also to recommend corrective courses of action in order to reduce our exposure. That assessment resulted to 22 recommendations. And in my last report out to this committee, 11 of those 22 recommendations were fully implemented. In this current report, I'm going to add one more to that list, bringing it up from 11 to 12 fully implemented recommendations. The most recent one called for cross-referencing the address in our employee database versus the district's vendor database. This may reveal instances in which an employee either owns or is somehow related to one of our vendors. And this may also reveal instances in which there may be a potential conflict of interest. This procedure resulted in 2 hits or 2 cases. And in each of those cases, I looked at whether the employee is in a position to influence our invoice payment process. And I also looked at a sample of those invoices to determine whether our procedures for approving invoices were followed. I'm happy to report that I did not find any instances of impropriety. And I intend to repeat this procedure once every quarter. That's the end of my report. Dave?
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions for Mr. Empanad? Okay, thank you very much, sir.
With that, this is the summary slide here, or your report takeaways. As noted there, the ending cash balance surged late in the fiscal year. We finished $9 million higher than the prior fiscal year. The end of the general fund revenue lagged the budget by about 6.5 million on June 30th. The PPG-EMT payment gap persists, where about approximately $7.2 million are due for the full 18-month period. General fund expenditures finished $5.9 million lower than budgeted. And we saw that CERT fund balance rise to a new record of 87.2 million. With that, I welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you. Any questions or comments? Does that mean yes or no? Okay. All right, it's been received and filed. Thank you very, very much for both, well, technically all 3 presentations. 2 from you and 2 from Ron. So thank you all very much.
Yeah.
All right, is there anything for the good of the order? If not, this meeting is hereby adjourned into our next session, September 26th, 2024.